Hi everyone, I'm back in a slightly different location because we're going to do something a little different today. You see, I've played video games in my day. Now granted, I don't play them as much as I used to, but one franchise of video games that I'm certainly aware of is the Assassin's Creed series. Now this is a series of action games that essentially takes the player to different historical locations and then you kill a bunch of guys basically. But the interesting thing about the Assassin's Creed franchise is the incredible research team that they seem to have over there at Ubisoft. They managed to recreate these historical locations in just magnificently wonderful ways. So there's a game called Assassin's Creed Origins, which take place in Egypt, and there is one called Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is in ancient Greece, and a bunch of others, and they are always incredibly well done in terms of the historical accuracy. Of course, I was quite excited to learn that the new game, the upcoming game in the series, is going to take place in Baghdad in the 9th century, which is a subject that, of course, is incredibly interesting because we discuss events and people and so on from that period quite a lot on this channel. So last week or a few weeks ago, I'm not sure when, they released a trailer. So the first sort of premiere trailer for this new game. So what I thought we'd do is that we'd watch this trailer together and then I will react and comment on the things I'm seeing and what I find interesting in terms of how they portray this very significant historical location. And who am I to say anything about this, you may ask? Well, I guess I'm a sort of expert. In what sense am I an expert? Well, I guess my expertise would lie in Islam. So I have studied comparative religion. I have a master's degree in comparative religion. And what we do here on Let's Talk Religion, for those of you who are new, is that we talk about a bunch of different historical and contemporary topics related to religion. And my expertise and particular field of research in the past have been Islam and the Islamic world, which this is obviously an example of. Without any further ado, let's start watching this trailer. Snake, nothing all that interesting at this point. These would be the so-called assassins, I guess, which is the sort of the group that the protagonists of these games belong to. So there is something really interesting that I saw. I noticed that last time too, and it's this book here. This book here is really interesting. It reminds me of many fascinating examples of books from the Islamic world. I am reminded of the Ajaib al-Makhluqat by a guy called Qazwini, which doesn't make sense because that wouldn't have come out at this point. So I'm trying to figure out if this could be a reference to a specific book. It looks like one of those scientific treatises that were quite common at the time. Could be something like an occult book 2, which would have looked like this with images and so on. Another book that this reminds me of is the Kitab al-Hayawan, the book of animals, essentially, by a guy called Al-Jahiz. And he did live right around this time. So this is supposed to take place around 850 or 860 AD, I think. And that was right around the time that Al-Jahiz, who was a famous theologian and philosopher and writer, scholar, wrote his books, and one of the most famous of his books is called the Kitab al-Hayawan, and this could be that. So don't take that with a huge grain of salt. I'm totally speculating here, just based on the fact that there's an animal in this book and that the time period fits. But it would be really interesting if this was a reference to that book, and if perhaps Al-Jahiz, who would have lived in Baghdad, if he somehow makes an appearance in this game, that would be really cool. So here, so this is something that bothered me about this thing, because this certainly appears to be tea. Tea was not a thing at this point in Baghdad. It was barely a thing in China. Certainly black tea had not been invented yet. And this does definitely look like black tea. And so that, to me, seems like a kind of historical inaccuracy. Now, this could be, I guess, could be some sort of herbal tea, which was prominent at that time. Based on the color, it looks like it could be some kind of hibiscus tea, which was known as karkadiyya, or is known as karkadiyya in Arabic. that usually has sort of a reddish color. This does look a little more brown to me, which, you know, again, suggests something like black tea. But, you know, I could give him the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe it's some sort of herbal tea. Could be hibiscus tea, could be chamomile was common at this time too. Certainly doesn't look like chamomile, but still, I thought that was really interesting.
To sacrifice everything you held close.
I am.
Really beautiful stuff. I like the clothes. This is one thing also that I really noticed here is that there's a lot of color in this trailer, right? The clothes that people wear are very colorful. You see the things around the marketplace. There's a lot of color, and I really like that because Baghdad in the 9th century was very colorful. People wore colorful clothes. There were colors everywhere. And usually when we see depictions of the Middle East, even in earlier games in the Assassin's Creed series, it's usually very, very sort of, it's not very saturated, right? It's very damp in terms of colors, a bit gray, maybe sort of dusty, yellowish, brown, everything, or people are wearing white or black, basically. That was not what this environment looked like in reality. This was a very colorful place, a very colorful city, and I really like that they seem to be going for that look here because that is historically accurate, and it's a breath of fresh air, I think, in terms of depictions of the Middle East, both today and historically.
Are you ready to do? Then out of the dark you will come into the light.
So again, these would be the so-called assassins, right, with the hoods and everything. There is a really interesting connection between the assassins in the games and the actual assassins of history, because they were kind of a real group, even though the game, of course, takes some serious creative liberties in terms of portraying them. I made a full video about that on the channel, actually, which you can check out if you're interested, where I discuss and explore the story and the historical context of the first game in this series in particular, and the real assassins. So the real assassins were a group of Ismaili Shi'i Muslims who, because they were persecuted, would sort of take over and gather in these mountain fortresses around western Iran and also in some places in Syria. And they became known as the assassins. It's not entirely known why this name came to be, and they used military tactics against their enemies that we associate with the word assassin. So they would send out people to kill their enemies, basically, in very sort of clever and undercover ways. And so that is the historical basis for the assassins in these games. Now, this would have taken place long before the assassins as such were a thing. There were Ismaili Shiites at this point, and in Baghdad too, as far as I know. But they wouldn't have been known as the assassins, and they wouldn't have used those military tactics at this point either. So I think in terms of the lore of the games, this is seen as some sort of precursor to the assassins. But yeah, so that's some of the historical context behind it. And again, if you want to know more about the actual context of the assassins and Alamut and all that stuff, the actual assassins, then you should watch my actual video on that topic. And here we go. So this, finally then, this is the skyline of Baghdad, essentially. You can see the great palace, I suppose. This has to be the palace, right? And maybe that's the mosque. So, or the other way around. So Baghdad was, at this point, was very famous. It was called sometimes the Round City. It was built in sort of concentric circles. So at the center of the city was the palace of the caliph, which would be this basic sort of place. And then the rest of the city would be in sort of circles around that palace. So there's a palace there in the middle, and then there was a mosque, sort of the great mosque of the city. And that has to be this place, right? You can't really see, at least I can't, you can't really see that rounded shape. Well, I guess if you look, so if this is the center of the city, then you can sort of see how the buildings go around it in a sense. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they implement that city structure into the game. It's a very interesting way to build a city. I always thought that was really fascinating. So this has to be the palace and the mosque. I'm not sure which is which. This could be minarets, which means this could be the mosque, and then this would be the palace. So this was the palace of the famous Abbasid Caliph. So this was during the Abbasid Caliphate, the often called the Golden Age of Islam, right? And this was the center of that entire world. This was, in many ways, this was the center of the world, period. This was an incredible place of flourishing in so many fields, in science, in literature, it was the spiritual and religious center in a sense, except for Mecca and Medina probably. The Caliph ruled basically all of the Islamic world at this point from this palace. It's, famous caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and so on. And again, Baghdad at this time was basically the center of the world. People came from all around the world. It was a center of science. It was a center of the so-called translation movement. The translation movement was in full force at this time. This was a movement where scholars would translate texts from all around the world, so Greek texts, Indian texts, Persian texts, into Arabic. And so promote science and philosophy and knowledge in general. There was a place called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in which all of this took place, essentially. So this is an incredibly interesting place, and I've been looking forward to them having this as a location for one of their games, because it is one of the most interesting places and time periods in history, I think, because so much is happening in the city at the time. Theological debates, scientific and philosophical development, some significant religious development in terms of the religion of Islam, a lot of this is some of the formative years of that religion. It's really, really interesting. So this is going to take place in around 850 or 860 AD, I believe, which immediately makes me think about the historical figures that might make an appearance in the game. Because usually Ubisoft will include some significant historical figures. Some of the games had Leonardo da Vinci, for example, or the one on ancient Greece had Socrates. So usually there are some of those people, and I'm really excited to see if any of the significant people from this time and place show up. So in terms of people from this time period, we have someone like Al-Kindi, who I'm incredibly fascinated by, a great Arab philosopher who was at the head of the so-called translation movement, translating texts from Greek and so on, but also writing incredible texts on all topics of philosophy and science, like logic and metaphysics and music even, and much else. He was an incredible genius, really, and he lived at around this time in Baghdad, actually in close connection with the caliphs. I think he died in 875. There's also a guy called Abu Ma'shar, who's a famous sort of astrologer or astronomer at this point, often strongly connected with Al-Kindi. He could also be making an appearance. I already mentioned Al-Jahiz, a famous theologian, Mu'tazili theologian, wrote the Kitab al-Hayawan and much else. He is also in this place at this time and could make an appearance. Maybe even someone like Ahmed ibn Hanbal, although he died, when did he die? He died in like 855, I think, so maybe this is a bit too late for him. Yeah, so these are the kind of things that is taking place in this year at the time. A lot of theological debate, a lot of philosophical and scientific development, and just a lot of really interesting stuff. Obviously, the caliphs are going to show up in some way. I am not an expert on the history of the caliphs. So who's caliph at this point? So this is right at the end of Abbasid control, basically. Technically, the Abbasids would still rule the caliphate until the 13th century when the Mongols invaded. But for most of that period, they were sort of only symbolic rulers, whereas other forces were actually in control, like the Seljuks and others. And so this is right at the end, I think, or the last years of Abbasid rule proper, when they actually had full power of the empire. And so who's the caliph at this point? It's Al-Mutawakkil. I know that my colleague Siawish from the channel Al-Muqaddimah knows a lot about this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already made a video about this. So go check out that on his channel if you're interested in that. But yeah, the caliphs and the sort of political situation of the Abbasids is probably going to make an appearance. That seems likely. Now, especially interesting for me because I have specialized so much in what is known as Sufism or Islamic mysticism. This is also a really interesting period because it is in Baghdad and right around this time that Sufism as we know it actually starts to develop. This is the sort of birthplace of Sufism in a certain way. Sufis existed before this, but it is in Baghdad in the late 9th and 10th centuries that we see a group forming, and many of these ideas and doctrines associated with Sufism starts to be systematized and be written about for the first time. And so if this is 860, that would mean that figures like some of the founders of the Baghdad school of Sufism, like Sari al-Saqati and al-Muhasibi, would be here. Even someone like Junaid, who is probably the most famous and central mystic and Sufi from this point, he would have been young. If this is 860, he's like 30. But, it's possible that he and some of his associates, the Sufis, could be part of this. Do I expect them to be? Probably not. That's a pretty niche thing. Although at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if they make some sort of appearance. That would be really exciting for me, obviously. So yeah, this place, this city at this time is just such a melting pot of so much interesting stuff. And it's such a central and crucial moment in the history of the Islamic world. So yeah, a fascinating, incredibly interesting time and place. Yeah, so the rest of the video is just a bunch of action sequences that aren't really that interesting for us in this particular context of this video. But yeah, that's it. That's really cool. That's really cool. I think games like this is a really good way of educating people about these kinds of historical locations. Again, like I said about the earlier games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Assassin's Creed Odyssey, really great for educating people and introducing people to the worlds of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. And those games usually have something called the Discovery series, which is basically just you walking around the world and a voice telling you about all the historical context of what you're seeing. And that stuff is amazing. I think there's a really important future of education in this kind of media. And so for us on this channel, when we're talking about religion, obviously using something like a video game, which is something that many people consume, and talking about it and talking about the context and what's going on, I think could be really interesting and fun. But also I think something very valuable in terms of education going forward. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was interesting. I sure thought it was really fun to just go through this thing and start speculating about all the historical context and things that I could find in the trailer. I would love to do more stuff about pop culture in the future and see how we can use pop culture to explore the world of religion and history in various ways. So let me know in the comments what you thought. And also if you're interested or excited about this game. And I will see you in the next video, which should probably be more similar to my usual videos. So I'll see you then.